Hi guys, Mark's here, Everything Tenere. Today we're gonna start off with episode 1 in a 2-episode series of suspension deep dive. And episode 1 we will go through the OEM setup. Everything in the front and the rear about the different adjusters, rebound, compression, preload, and also go deep dive into the cartridge in the front and see what everything is called, what its name, where it's set, how it works. And then we will go to the garage and check how to set the sag and everything about that. But before we start, I just want to show you guys what we will talk about in the second episode, and that's pretty much all this. So everything from aftermarket springs, valve kits, cartridge kits, complete suspensions, and all that. So yeah, that's it. So let's start with what? Yeah, let's start with this. Yeah, this is the OEM cartridge and rear shock. And this is what we get. Now I just have one front cartridge here, so it's not the complete leg, but what sits inside the golden tube and the chromed leg in the front, and the rear shock. So we will start off talking about the cartridge itself. So here we have the OEM open cartridge. It's a 20mm cartridge, or the cylinder here is 20mm. We have, this is the bottom of the cartridge, this is the top. So in the top we have the cap with the rebound adjuster and a pressure release valve. We have the spring, we have the spring guide, and in the bottom we have the compression adjuster, which is removable. So I will disassemble the leg or the cartridge so you can see how every part looks like. So we got the cartridge disassembled, or almost the complete cartridge. It's only one part that I cannot remove right now from this cartridge, and I will come to that. We of course have our cap or top cap, which have the rebound adjustment and the pressure release valve. We have a spring seat or washer. We have the spring guide, the nut for the spring guide. We also have the pin or the shaft for the rebound adjuster. So this goes in here. So when you click on your rebound adjuster, it will push on this shaft down to the rebound valve and shim stack, which sits in here on the piston. So it goes with the piston in here. We have the compression valve stack and shims, which is this one. So the shim stack sits here, and it goes in the bottom of the leg. We also have a hydraulic end stop, which is this part. So it goes into a seat here, so when your suspension is fully pushed together and you have reached your end, this is what hits everything. And this hydraulic end stop, it forces oil out around it. So when you get closer and closer to the end here, it will get a bit tougher for this to move down. So you will have like a tiny oil cushion down there. But we know this is not always working as it should, or not as good as you would want it to. And when you smash through the travel of your front fork too many times, you get a ping sound, and you can actually break the spring guide. And there are aftermarket ones that you can order and replace it with a new hydraulic stop. And I will come to that in part 2. When it comes to the adjustments and everything for both rebound and compression, the clickers, what they do, you have a little bypass valve in this one. So the service manual states that all the clicks is from fully closed. So when you see 6 clicks out from in the service manual, that's from fully closed, so fully clockwise. So if you close up off this all the way, that's fully closed. Then you force more oil through the shim stack. So if you open it up, this bypass valve will open more and more. So oil do not get forced through the shim stack, and not all the oil. So that's how you control how much this is working together with you. So if it's fully closed off, most of the oil goes through the shim stack. If you take clicks off and loosen it up, you will have more oil that will pass by the shim stack and not through it. Same goes for the rebound one. So you do not really adjust something in the shim stack. That has to be done separately by replacing the valving in the shim stacks. You have different thickness and different sizes of shims, and that's how you change the feel of how the suspension works. You cannot just do it by the clickers. That will only bypass oil from the shim stack. So that's why we have valve kits out there. We will come to that in part 2. So that's about it when it comes to the front cartridge, how it works and all the different parts of it. I hope that is something good to know for sure, and you're not as afraid as I was the first time I removed my cartridge. Now let's go to the rear shock. So here we have the rear shock. It's pretty simple. We have rebound adjustment down here. Same with clickers here. The rebound and comp works exactly the same as the front does when it bypasses the oil and not go through the shim stack and so on, whatnot. We have the compression here, and this is a reservoir as well with oil. And the rear shock is pressurized with gas, so it's not as easy to maintain yourself, and you would need to, search and go to a suspension expert to have this serviced. Replacing the spring is not that hard, but if you need to replace the oil or seals or something in it, you would need to visit a suspension expert. So rebound, compression, and preload. So preload here will move the cam here and push the spring down. So this is how we change the sag in the rear. And a spring, so this is really undersprung. It's for about a 75 kilo rider, both front and rear. So if you need to use a lot of preload, it's not as good as if you replace the spring. And we will come to that in part 2 as well. So a spring that you fully utilize, it's the full length of the spring, and not when you have already compressed it a lot. So it works better if you have no preload here. So if you can replace your spring to get the correct sag, that's better than using too much of your preload here on the rear shock. And it's good for, if you have a pillion rider, or if you have a lot of bags and stuff when you go out on adventures, then the preload is golden, right? So, and we're missing preload in the front, and that's one of the drawbacks with the OEM setup, and we will come to that in part 2 as well. So that's pretty much all about the front and rear suspension, the OEM one. And now we will talk about sag and what the importance are, or the important is with rebound and compression settings, and especially sag. So sag is the amount of travel that you already have used up when sitting on the bike. So we have something called static sag, which is the sag the bike has when just the bike stands up from its side stand or central stand, with no other thing, on the bike. That's supposed to be about 10%. The rider sag, or race sag as we also call it, is somewhere between 25 and 30%. Normally you say 27%. And we know that our front fork has a travel of 210 millimeters and the rear has a travel of 200 millimeters. So that means that if we're gonna have a rider sag at, let's say 30%, That's 30% of the complete travel of the rear, so 30% of 200 millimeters. Same with the front, we say 30%, that's roughly 55 to 60 millimeters of sag or rider sag. So that's when you are fully loaded with the gear that you're supposed to have on you when you go out ride, or with your backpack, camping gear or whatnot. So you measure the sag with the gear that you have on you or bring with you when you go out riding. So it's very important that you just don't take your sag measurements once and then forget about it, because it changes. You might eat more hamburgers than I do, and or what I did like 2 months ago when I put my sag in or dialed my sag in, and now I'm heavier, so I would need to adjust my sag to get the best performance out of my suspension. So the sag is important because we need to have some suspension left when we sit on the bike, so that can push out. So if we go down to a pothole, the front wheel and rear wheel need to follow the pothole and then come up again. If we do not have any sag, you will have a really bumpy ride, it will be less traction, and it will be a very nervous front end and rear end as well. So the goal with a perfect suspension is to feel like you're riding on clouds, right? And with this setup, it's pretty hard actually, but you want to make the best of it, and then you need to dial down the sag to the correct measurements. And I will show you that, how you measure that and how you do that as well, especially for the rear. The front is pretty easy. The sag in the front with the OEM one, you cannot do much if you don't buy aftermarket parts for it. And it's not that expensive, just a new pair of springs or preload spacers, but we will talk about that in part 2. It's also very important to set your rebound and compression. A rebound especially, because if you have no rebound at all, so it's all the way opened up, so there is pretty much a very small amount of oil that passes through the shim stack in the rebound valves. Then when you push the fork down, the rebound is controlling the return of the movement from push down to then returning to zero again. So if we have no rebound, it will return really quick, as fast as the spring can push it back. That will cause a really bumpy ride, very nervous and bad traction in corners and whatnot. So you want to limit the movement of the suspension so it smoothly comes back to its zero position. Same goes for the compression, but we will control how fast it compresses the front suspension and rear. So if it's too little compression added, it will just go through the stroke really quickly. If we add more compression on, it will take more force for it to really go through the stroke and also be a bit slower to react. And that's it. And as I said before, the sag is controlled by the spring, nothing else. So here we can control it with the preload adjuster. In the front we cannot, because we don't have a preload adjuster for the OEM setup. But yeah, we will come more into that, and I advise you to check out Robert or Nomad Sweden. He did a little adjustment of his suspension, so you have a link up here, and you can follow his guide as well, and he felt a difference. I advise you to try this out and dial in your suspension on a known good road or track or trail somewhere where you have ridden a lot of times, and then play with your suspension, write the numbers up so you don't forget, and then try different settings and ride again and see if you can feel a difference. And that's how you really nail down your settings. But let's head out to the garage and check how you set the sag and control the sag. So now we're in the garage, and we're gonna first off check how you check your sag in the front, and then we will move to the rear. So to do so, it's good to have a measuring tape or a slider gauge or something to measure with. A zip tie is good. I do have a O-ring here on the chrome part of the leg, so I don't need a zip tie, and it's much easier to have that on there all the time. I will start up by pushing this all the way up to the dust cap, and you will do the same with the zip tie. After that, you have put on all your gear that you have when riding, all the luggage that is, you're supposed to have with you when you go out riding, and then you mount the bike. So I will do that now. And if you're two people, it's a bit easier, because if the bike is cold, the suspension haven't been moving up and down, you might want to work the suspension back and forward a bit, but then you need to push up the O-ring or zip tie again, so it's not pushed down. And then I put my feet on the foot pegs. I balance towards the wall here with my left arm, and you sit just normally as you're sitting and riding. You can stand up as well, but don't do any sudden movement, because you might push the suspension down more than you're supposed to. Then I carefully dismount the bike. And you can see there that the dust cap already moved the O-ring down a bit. We cannot measure the sag right now, because the suspension is still under tension from the bike's weight. So you either use a central stand, a bike lift, or you do like I do when checking the front. I just push upwards on the handlebars, and this will relieve the suspension of stress, or how would you say it. And then I just measure from the dust cap to the O-ring, and I see here that I have 50 millimeters of sag right now, but I do not have my gear on, so I weigh less. So this is good for me. I know my sag is about 58 or something millimeter when having gear on. And if you want to have 30% rider sag, it's 63 millimeters. So I usually go by 27%, so between 55 and 60 millimeters of rider sag. So that's the front. And now we go to the rear, which is a bit more tricky. So we're at the rear, and it's a little bit more trickier. It's hard to do yourself. You need to have a helper. You cannot measure the sag straight onto the rear shock, because we have a linkage. So we need to first of all measure the full length between the swing arm and a fixed part up on the bike. So usually you take the center of the rear tire axle, and then pick a point up here somewhere. I usually pick this heat shield, and then I go from the edge of the swing arm here. So we check the distance from here to there, and make sure that the bike is not under any load. So it's easier if you have a bike lift here to just lift the rear end up. So we can see here now that it's 55 or 550 millimeters, and we know that we should have a sag at 60 millimeters. So that means when I sit down on the bike and my friend helps me to measure between the same points, it should be 490 millimeters distance between here and there. Then we have the correct sag of 60 millimeters. So I have no helper at the moment, so I cannot show you that, but it's the same idea as in the front. We need here to measure the full distance here first, between two fixed points, one on the swing arm or center axle or rear tire axle, and then a fixed part up here on the bike, and check the distance when the suspension is under no load, and then sit on the bike with all your gear and luggage and check the same between the same points what distance you have there. And you know that it should be able to travel this much, 200 millimeters, right? So we remove 60 from that. So it's easy, nothing harder than that. Pretty darn easy, but the rear one, it's harder due to that you need help from someone. So now we have checked the sag in the front and the rear, and if you have too little sag in the rear, you need to let go on the preload adjuster. If you have too much sag, you will put more preload on. And as I said before, you know, if you use a lot of preload to get the correct sag in the rear, you might need to go up to a heavier spring, and we will talk about that in part 2. If you cannot succeed to have the correct preload, or I mean sag, in the front, you're in bad luck, so to say, because we cannot adjust the sag or any preload in the front, and we would need to add aftermarket parts to do that. And we will talk about that in the part 2 episode. Otherwise, I already talked about the compression and rebound, and I advise you all to, you know, play with your suspension settings, add more rebound first off, because it makes a big difference. Then you can add some more compression as well, and go and ride a trail or some part where you ride a lot, so you really can feel the difference in behavior of the suspension. And it should feel like riding on clouds, right, as I said before, but it's pretty impossible with this OEM setup. But it for sure will be much better if you tweak the settings a bit. So just play around with all the different suspension settings that you have to play with. You know, check your sag first off, most important, and then you can play around with rebound and compression. And remember, rebound in the front is on top on the cap, compression is in the bottom of the leg, and on the rear shock you have the rebound in the bottom, and you have the compression adjuster up there. It's like a golden little knob with a flathead screwdriver screw on. So that's about it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into the front and rear OEM suspension, and that it helped you to understand a little bit more how it works. And I'll see you in episode 2, when we will talk about aftermarket solutions, suspension, cartridge kits, springs, valve kits, you name it. So take care, have fun on the trails, stay safe, and cheerios. Bye bye.